13, 10 through 17. Luke 13, 10 through 17. And as he was teaching on one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was abode together, and could in no wise lift up herself. And when Jesus saw her, he called her to him, and said unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thy infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and glorified God. And the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, There are 6 days in which men ought to work, and in them therefore come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. And the Lord then answered him and said, Thou hypocrite, doth not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his ass from the stall, and lead him away to watering? And ought not the woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan hath bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from his bound on the Sabbath day? And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed, and all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. It's good to see all of you out. And like Darren was saying, I was kind of thinking the same thing. It's like, wow, it might be sparse in the crowd today, but then all the seats started filling up, and it was, this is good. So glad you all could be here. We're glad to be here as well. And we're looking forward to just talking about Christ and talking about all the things that he can do, that he does and has done for us. And that today, as we're diving into this lesson from Luke chapter 13, that we don't get bent out of shape. This is something that happens, I'm sure, frequently enough, and probably too frequently, more frequently than we want to admit to us. We get bent out of shape over something. We're watching our favorite team get slaughtered, and we're just getting all upset and getting riled up. And we get mad, and we start, shouting at the TV, shouting at some of the players who made mistakes, who did this wrong, who did that wrong, whatever, and we get bent out of shape over something. Somebody did us wrong, and we get bent out of shape because they said something to me that just isn't true, isn't right. They shouldn't have said that. They shouldn't have done this. All these things are wrong. All these things that they've said is just terrible. Myself included on that, because, I was just telling Kayla, yesterday, and I was like, I can't remember if I told you this or not, but, there's just this one individual that when a particular person brings this individual up, just drops this name, and it wasn't even the person that they were talking about. I was mistaken, and I got upset because they name dropped somebody, and I immediately went to somebody who I don't care for because of the things that they've said, the things that they've done. And I realized that, and I'm like, I can't even stand when that person's name is being brought up. And it's not even the person that they were talking about. I'm like, as soon as they said, and it's not anybody's name here. So if I'm talking to anybody here, it's no one's name here. But yeah, I just was like so upset, and I told him, I'm like, I can't even talk about that person with you because of this. And so we get bent out of shape, and we see in this passage that there is a few things that we're going to be talking about that are bent out of shape. And I don't want to, go about this in necessarily from a physical standpoint, because whenever we look at this passage, whenever we dive down into this is actually more spiritual than it is physical. When we read this passage in Luke chapter 13, and we see this lady, starting at verse 10 there. It says that he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. This is Jesus. And behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bent over and could in no way raise herself up. But when Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said to her, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. Now, one thing real quick I do want to mention, this is just a very interesting thing about this passage. From verse 11, the number 18 is mentioned, as well as in verse 18. And this is just something that is considered not a coincidence. Whenever you look at what scholars believe on this is actually a mnemonic for the oral reading of this, that this is a number that they would have associated, and they would have recognized 18 as being part of this passage here, because at the time, they didn't have all the sections, they didn't have everything broken up by chapters, by verses. This would have been something, 18, hey, that reminds me of this story here and there about repenting and about this lady who had been bent over and how she had been healed. It would have helped them to remember that. So just an interesting point that I thought was worthy of being shared. But we see here that Luke, as is a physician, right? This is what he does is he is a doctor in that time. And so when he makes mention of this woman, does he say, what she had? Does he say that she had, like scoliosis? Did she had, some sort of, now I can't think of any of the medical terms that your bones would, cause that to happen or any of those things. But, he's not making mention that this is a physical infirmity necessarily. It causes something physical to have happened to her, to be bent over literally, physically, that she could not stand up straight. But this was a spirit of infirmity that Jesus will heal her from. This is something that is spiritual about her. And it was brought upon her by Satan. That's what this is. This is what's not allowing her to stand up straight. And I know of an individual that he walked around the entire perimeter of Walmart just about every single day, morning and night. He would come back to the store morning and night, and he would walk the entire perimeter of the Walmart that we had in Ripley, West Virginia, which was larger. That is the largest store that I've ever worked in for a little podunk town, Ripley, West Virginia, that was the lowest volume store that I worked with, but they had the largest square footage. And he would walk around that entire perimeter of that building, even though he was bent over like this. He would walk around the store and he would have his hands behind him like this, and he would walk very fast, very quick, because he needed still to get his exercise. He didn't let that hold him back. But here we see a woman, this similar situation, that this has happened to her, and she's been like this for 18 years. 18 years. And Jesus uses this as an opportunity to teach a lesson. Jesus uses this as an opportunity to show his power and to kind of upset the individuals that were present here this day. Jesus has always done this. He is always, whenever he does these kinds of healings, whenever he does these kinds of things, he's doing this because he knows that there's a lesson that can be learned. And we see in other instances where whenever he makes mention in his prayers even, he says, I don't say this because, I need to say this, that I need to ask this, but I'm saying this for those that are around so that way they can learn, so that way they can be instructed. So we see that this is something that is happening by Jesus as instruction for those that were around and for us as well to learn from. Because we might be walking around with bent physically, we might be walking around bent out of shape in a way because of some sort of spiritual affliction that we're enduring. And so we see this as a lesson, and we see that Jesus is able to heal those individuals that are like this. That when you go to Jesus, he will heal you spiritually. And I won't say all the time. I mean, I'm not saying, that once you commit your life to Jesus, once you have obeyed the call and you have been baptized, and it's going to remove whatever physical ailments you have because those are spiritual. No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there are some times that physically things will manifest because of a spiritual sickness that we have. Whether that's because, something that has happened because, we have chosen sin, and so now we have to deal with the reward that we are reaping from that. Even though it's a bad reward, it's something that we have to pay for, that we have to suffer because of our wrongdoing. Thinking about someone like David, who had sinned with Bathsheba, and then his child died because of it as a consequence of that sin. But we see that she does not seek this out, but he chooses to do this for her and heals her. There's so many times that we need to have this healing in our life because of how bent out of shape we are spiritually. But Jesus is there, and he's here for you today to heal you, and only he can straighten you out in this way. And as I was saying, that he's doing this to teach a lesson to those that are around, and we find that there is a bent out of shape leader in this passage. In verse 14 it says, "The ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, and he had said to the crowd," didn't talk to Jesus, he said to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which men ought to work, therefore come and be healed on them and not on the Sabbath." And you can just kind of picture somebody that is doing this, and they just have their arms crossed, and they see this happen, and they just kind of turn their head, and they're just like, there's 6 days that you could have done this, but you choose this Sabbath day when we're not supposed to be doing anything to heal him. So you choose this day to do this. And so he's not even addressing Christ. He's just saying this offhanded. He's saying this backhanded. And he, as a leader, should know what he's doing. And he does. He's using this as a tactic. But I want to mention Matthew chapter 18 and this, because there are some times where, and this might not happen from a church leader necessarily, but when we are associated with the church, and people know that we are Christians, and people know that we go to church on Sundays and that we go to Bible study on Wednesdays, and they know that day in and day out we try to live as a Christian, and yet when something happens and we say something offhanded like this, and when we say things that not even directed to this person to try and help them in any way, so maybe I'm not saying Jesus is confused on this, but perhaps the religious leader could have talked with Jesus instead, could have instructed him, "Hey, do you not know that there are we try to keep the Sabbath holy, we try not to do these things because this is the day that God rested, this is the day our Creator rested, so we're not trying to do these things," and taught him or something. But he doesn't do that. He says something out of line. He says something because he gets bent out of shape and says something off the cuff without thinking about what he's saying. And sometimes we might do that too. And people then will take our word as something, a little higher and hold us, accountable for that. But in Matthew chapter 18, in verse 1, we see that at this time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a little child to him and sat him in the midst of him and said, "Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offenses come." Wow. That is a very harsh teaching. And so if we say something that by no means goes against what the Scriptures necessarily say, but we've taken something, we've thrown it out of context, and we say something off color, out of line, because we're bent out of shape, and we lead somebody astray because of that, because of our misteachings, because of our misapplication of something, woe to that individual. Woe to that individual. And here we have this religious leader doing exactly this. And not just him only. There's several others that were doing this kind of thing. But here he is a bent out of shape leader, and this is what he's doing. But Jesus gets on to him. Jesus gets on to him and says that, because imagine if he was the man, if he was the one that had bent over for the 18 years, his view on this would have been drastically different, but it wasn't. Because he's following a bent out of shape law in this matter. He's following a bent out of shape law. And there were these, the oral traditions that were written down, the Mishnahs that they had. This was something that Jesus makes a point about. And so we'll turn back to Luke chapter 13, back in verse 15. It says, the Lord answered and said, "Hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it away to water? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, think of it, for 18 years be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath?" And when he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for the glorious things that were done by him. So here Jesus is making a very timely and humiliating point out of this because of this religious leader's comment, because of what he's saying here. And he's calling him a hypocrite because even this individual takes mercy upon his animals. Is that not work? Is that not considered work? Well, we allow that because, the animals have to drink. The animals have to eat too. We can't just let them sit there and starve and get thirsty. But you're going to say, well, this lady here isn't allowed to have this healing on the Sabbath? She's not allowed to have the convenience to be able to just stand upright. You're going to say she needs to stay bent over. She needs to stay in that place of shame. Do you think that she was, welcomed all over the place? No, because usually the Jews thought if you had something along these lines, that you had something wrong with you. You were usually outcast. You were ostracized. You were, not socially accepted in all cases. Imagine the tortures that she had to live with day in and day out. She probably couldn't even have looked up and seen Jesus as he was reading this day until after he healed her. But in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 12, we see that Jesus has, that commentary on that as well, where he's saying, do we consider, how much more value then is a man than a sheep? How much more value is a sheep than a person? Is there? Is there more value to a sheep than a person? Absolutely not. And I think every single person would agree with that. And even in those times, they would have agreed with that. That was an oversight. And that was something that he was saying just because it was a tradition that they had. He was fighting against their traditions. He was fighting against those things that they had. And they had all kinds of these things. They had all kinds of these traditions that they would follow. And whenever you're looking into these things, you see that there are several things that they would do. And one of those things was, how they would view people like the tax collectors, and how they would, how the individuals that would collect the taxes often would have to go and pay the Romans up front, whatever it is the taxes were in that area, the district that they were going to be taxing, that they were going to collect the taxes for the Romans in. They would have to pay up front those costs. And then so whenever they would go around and collect the taxes, people would say, oh, you're collecting more than what you needed to. Well, probably because maybe they're trying to get geared up and ready for the next set of taxes. Who's to say on that? But they had to pay those taxes, and so that's why these individuals, the tax collectors, would be looked down upon, and that they would be called sinners. It's because some of the people didn't agree with that, and they also the coins that they had that had the Caesar's depiction on there, just like our coins have pictures of presidents on there. They would have seen that as idolatrous because Caesar wanted to be worshipped as a god. And so they would say, well, we can't even handle these coins. And that's why the point is even brought up about, should we pay taxes? Is it lawful to pay these taxes? And Jesus is like, What was Jesus' answer? Whose depiction is that on there? That's Caesar's, right? Okay, well, pay unto Caesar what's Caesar's. It's not an issue. Pay him those things. And that's also more reason whenever we look at when Jesus is chasing the money changers out of the temple area, why is he chasing them out of there? It's not necessarily because they have, weighed the scales in their favor, but because all these pilgrims would come in to offer their sacrifices. They would bring foreign currency into that area, and you couldn't pay with a foreign currency. In the Old Testament, in the law, whenever they were to pay for the upkeep of the temple, it was half a shekel for each man. And so they had to pay that. So these people would come into town, and they would not have the correct currency for the temple tax, and so they would have to exchange their money. And then there were these people that would take advantage of that, and they would not only just exchange that by the weight of what they were exchanging it for, but they would take commissions as well. They would take a little extra because they had to be there. They had to get a little cut of that as well. But here they had turned, and Jesus is very upset with them because here they had turned this into something that it should never have become. That's not what that was about. It wasn't about making sure you had the exact kind of currency to hand in. It also wasn't about making sure that whenever you are tithing, as he gets on to them for their tithing, the Pharisees, and how they would tithe all the way down to every single herb and spice that they had, people would use that as a reason to not take care of their father and mother. That was one of their things, because they would have that designated. They would say, well, I have this set aside, and so because this is set aside for the Lord, I can't give that to take care of my mom and my dad. I can't take that to house my parents. People would use every excuse in the book in order to get out of those things. Is that following God's law? Or was that following the traditions that they had imposed? Because the Mishnahs were just recordings of these Jewish leaders arguing, and whenever they would finish in court, and they would say, okay, well, this is the verdict, and we do the same thing. We follow after, verdicts of old laws, or of old, judgment calls, Roe v. Wade. Well, okay, well, this is how it turned out, so we'll just continue to follow along with that verdict. We'll continue to follow along with that. That's what they did too there. That's what the Mishnahs were. They had figured out something, they'd argued about it, come to a conclusion, and they said, okay, well, now this is how we're going to follow this from now on. But they were doing it and shaming others when they didn't. Do we do that today? Do we go to some passage, take it out of context, listen to some other, somebody, teach about this, and they have a construed message out of that verse, and then we use that to justify something that we do, or we use that and say, well, I can't believe that this person would do that, because if you look at this verse this way, then they're in sin because of what they're doing. And we get bent out of shape because we are bending the law out of shape. That's what we're doing when we do that. So are we carrying around Mishnahs of our own? Do we have some spiritual illness because we are doing something wrong with the Scriptures? We're converting it into something that it's not? Just a couple more passages that I want to turn to. In Galatians chapter 1. The first chapter of Galatians, starting at verse 6. This is what Paul is writing to the Galatians here. He says, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. Let him be anathema. And he says it again. As I have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. Paul really lays into them in this passage. He really goes, the extra mile to make sure that he's driving this point home. And he continues. He says, I made known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now concerning those things which I write to you, indeed before God I do not lie. Afterward I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown by face to the churches of Judea, which were in Christ, but they were hearing only. He who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith which he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God in me. So we see he's really driving this point home, that they have turned away from the gospel. They have turned away from the law as it should have been, from Christ's law as it should have been, to the teachings of other individuals that they've allowed to influence them. But he's saying, I didn't receive this from men. I didn't receive this from men. This isn't some sort of, thing that we've, come up with. That, we individuals here on earth. No, this is from Jesus. This is from Jesus. And so when we see this message in this passage, in Luke chapter 13, about how this individual who was spiritually ill was healed of her spiritual illness, this can be something that we take to heart as well, that we can see that Jesus is going to heal us spiritually as well. And that if we have something in our life that's holding us back, some sort of sin that we can't get away from. Satan is warring against us constantly, day in and day out. Jesus can heal you. Final passage, turn a few pages back to Luke chapter 5. Jesus answered and said to them, those who are well have no need of physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Today, if you are unrighteous, if you are a sinner, you have sin in your life, you have not been baptized yet, you have not obeyed the gospel call, Jesus is wanting to make you whole. Jesus is wanting to be the great physician for you as well. He can heal you. He can make you whole. He can, as you are now in your state of sinfulness, your lost state, imagine yourself as this individual who's bent over. You can't see what's going on around you. You don't know of your surroundings. You don't know anything that's going on. But this spiritual sickness that you have is going to cause you harm for eternity. But Jesus can heal you if you would just accept his healing nature, if you will just accept the call from him today. As Paul preached to the Galatians, as Paul preached to all the Gentiles, he also preaches to us. He says this is the true gospel, that Jesus came to this earth, was born of a woman, and he lived his life as a man and as God in the flesh, fulfilled all prophecy, fulfilled the old law completely, entirely, left nothing undone. He finished it. It is finished, were the words that he spoke on the cross. He died and was raised the third day, and then is ascended to heaven, preparing a place for us, and will return again. If you believe that, will you put him on in baptism today and be healed? If you have put on Christ and you have fallen away and you still have that something in your life that's brought you back into this state, and you need prayers of forgiveness, we can pray with you, we can pray for you. If you have just need of prayers in general for whatever may be going on, please let us know by taking a seat on the front as we stand and sing.